Oh, church, when did we lose our way?
Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. I'm your host, John Williamson, and we're back with a special bonus episode. This one is brand new content. I'm actually in the middle of releasing it for my other podcast, From the Void, where we talk about all sorts of strange and unusual mysteries. But as I was working on this particular episode, I thought, hey, this would fit nicely with the theme of what we discuss here on The Deconstructionist and would make for a fun holiday episode. So for this one, I sat down with Nora Creech. She works extensively on the Shroud of Turin. Some of you may have heard of this, but she works with a group called Athonia. They study the linen cloth, and she's an experienced lecturer on the history, science, and pastoral implications of the Shroud. Nora was kind enough to come on the show and share her vast knowledge behind the Shroud, what we know, what we don't know, the sorts of scientific tests that have been conducted, and the fact remains, though, that the authenticity of the Shroud remains controversial, which we discuss in the episode. Dan McClellan, who's been a guest on the show, and I'm a big fan of Dan's work, he recently did a really good episode on his podcast about the Shroud, his podcast called Data Over Dogma, and it's been written about extensively. There's tons of stuff out on the internet. But whether it's authentic or whether it's a hoax, the fact remains that at the end of the day, it still comes down to the question of faith, ultimately placing our trust in something that is unprovable and unquantifiable. So enjoy this episode. I'm releasing the full interview here as a bonus. I'd also like to say happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year to all of you out there listening. After nearly 10 years of doing this podcast, it still brings me a ton of joy to put these interviews out there in hopes it provides some value to all of you. So with much love from me, I hope you have a wonderful holiday season and a wonderful new year, and we'll be back next week, and technically next year, with brand new content. So thank you so much for listening, and without further ado, here's Nora freaking Creech.
We've driven the other away.
Okay, welcome to the podcast. Very excited to have my guest on this week, Nora Creech. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Thank you, John. I'm excited to be here.
Well, before we kick it off, because I think this is a really fascinating topic as we kind of discussed before we started recording, tell folks a little bit about your background and how you came to be connected with the Shroud of Turin.
So I became interested in the Shroud back in 1978, and that is a very important year in terms of the Shroud because it was the first and only time that there was a multidisciplinary study of the Shroud. And as it turns out, a member of my church community was one of the scientists who was a part of that scientific study. And so when he came back from his time in Turin, he started giving talks in our community in Colorado. And my father was very interested in the Shroud. And so my dad and I would go together. We'd go and listen to Rudolf Dichtel give his talks. And so it's been a lifelong interest of mine, really starting when I was a teenager in high school.
That's a really cool connection.
Mm-hmm.
So tell people, because, you know, this goes back well before, obviously the 70s, like we've had possession, of the Shroud for a very long time. So tell people, kind of give them the background on when was this artifact first discovered, where, and, you know, and that sort of thing.
So the history of the Shroud before the 1350s is murky. So there are a lot of people who are actively working on this, historians who are actively researching where the Shroud was, how it ended up in various places in its history before the 1350s. Starting in about the middle of the 1350s, the history of the Shroud is very, very well documented. It showed up in a little village in Liray, France for the first time, and it was being put on public exposition during that time. And the family that owned it would never say how they came to own it. So that's why there's this kind of murkiness in its past. But since 1350, its history is well known. The family that owned it, it passed down in their family line for a few generations, and then it was procured by the Savoy family, and the Savoy were the ruling family of the northern part of Italy and the southern part of France. They were a very powerful, wealthy, influential family, and they owned the Shroud for centuries. And in 1578, they moved the Shroud to their kind of government headquarters, which was in Turin, Italy. And it's an interesting thing. They built their palace, and then they built the cathedral, and in the middle, they built a chapel to house the shroud. And so the shroud was moved there in 1578, and it has been in Turin, Italy, all of that time, except for it did leave during World War II for safekeeping. So the Savoy family owned the shroud all the way up until 1983. And that is the time when the deposed king, King Umberto II, he was the last king of Italy. He was deposed during World War II. And upon his death, he gifted the shroud to the person of the Pope. And so the Pope at that time was Pope John Paul II. And so then now it's passed down. So technically the owner of the Pope today, or the owner of the shroud today is Pope Francis. And it's housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy to this day.
Interesting. So talk a little bit about, so obviously this initial family comes into possession of it. Again, as you said, kind of murky details in terms of how and where they located it. But what do we know for a fact, for certain, as of that kind of starting point?
Before the 1350s?
Or just like whatever the earliest date is, like what do we know for certain about the artifact?
Well, the burial cloth of Jesus is mentioned in all four Gospels. And so there is a burial cloth that is brought to the cross by Joseph of Arimathea. He's noted as a rich man, and it's noted as a fine piece of cloth. That is what is used to wrap the body of Jesus. Then we see again in the Gospel of John in chapter 20, after the resurrection, that John and Peter go into the tomb, and we often call it the empty tomb, but it really wasn't empty because the burial cloth was there. And John describes seeing the burial cloth and then also the face cloth that was folded up in a separate place by itself. And he's very clear. He says he saw and believed. So John is talking about himself and this understanding that came to him at this moment in the tomb, that he finally understood what Jesus was saying, that he had to rise from the dead. So those are really the earliest mentions of what today we call the Shroud of Turin. We could call it the burial cloth of Jesus. And from there's theories about where the cloth was. There's a strong theory that it went to Antioch with some of the disciples when they fled Jerusalem, because Antioch was a safe place for Christians. It was sort of the birthplace of Christianity. There was a big Christian community there. So there's some theories that it was there. There's also a legend that goes back to the king of Edessa, which is in modern day Turkey. And that was another place where Christianity became very strong. And there's a legend that a cloth bearing the face of Jesus was brought to the king of Edessa, and that it was safeguarded there for many centuries. There's also very strong evidence that the shroud was in Constantinople, that it was taken from Edessa to Constantinople at some time in its history. And of course, at that time, Constantinople was the center of the Christian world, and it was filled with wonderful, great, beautiful, valuable things. And then, of course, there was the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople and this terrible tragedy in the family of Christendom. And after that time, there's what is called the missing year. So if the cloth that we think today is the burial cloth of Jesus was in Constantinople, it disappeared in 1204 after the sack of Constantinople. And then this cloth later appears in this small village in Lille, France. So as I said, it's very murky, and there are a lot of people piecing it together, but it's still at the point of a lot of disagreement among scholars about what path it took, who owned it, how it came to be in different places at different times.
Yeah, and that's interesting that we can point back to earlier references to such a cloth. And so it tends to lend a little credibility to the fact that, well, people did believe that this existed somewhere. And so, now that we have this cloth, it seems to match some of the descriptions out there. Talk a little bit about the physical makeup, because, a big piece of it is, hey, this is a cloth from thousands of years ago. And how, did it survive all of those years? Because a lot of those materials would have deteriorated in a lot of cases.
So it's made of linen, and linen is an organic material. It comes from the flax plant. So linen has been discovered in a lot of the Egyptian tombs. And so there's linen that's even well older than the 2,000 years of the shroud. However, the thing that makes the shroud really unique is that it's in this herringbone twill, which is a 3/1 pattern. And the thing that's most similar to that today would be your Levi's jeans. They're a herringbone twill. And so in the first century, that would have been extremely valuable to produce because it was much more sophisticated than a 1-to-1, 1/1 weave. And there have been other linen cloths discovered that are the age of the shroud, and there have been other herringbone weave cloths found, but there has not been another single cloth that is both linen and a herringbone weave from that time period. So it's a very unique artifact. It's also very enormous. People are always really surprised by how big it is. It's over 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. And so in terms of its physical structure, for someone to own a piece of fabric like that during the time of Christ, it would have taken a very wealthy person, as Joseph of Arimathea is described as being.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, like, I think the piece that we haven't talked about yet, that's the most interesting about this cloth, is that it has this very unique image sort of burned into it. So talk about that, because obviously that is the big piece of this mystery here.
Yeah, so the Shroud of Jesus, or the Shroud of Turin, again, it's this enormous piece of cloth. And when you look at it, the things that will catch your eye there are burn marks on it, because throughout its history, it's endured some fires. It's also endured some water that perhaps was used to put out the fire, or maybe just was a part of the environment it was in. So there's burn marks, there's water stains, and then there's a lot of blood on the shroud. And so we can talk more about the blood, but that will also catch your eye. It still has retained its bright red color. And then if you look closely, you will see that there's a very faint image of a man. And the thing that is so fascinating is it's the head-to-head image. So going to one side is the frontal image of the man, and then going to the opposite side is the back image of the man. So you have to picture that the cloth was laid out flat. The man in death was put at one end of the cloth, and then it was wrapped over his head, so that the image is a head-to-head image on the inside of the cloth. And the particulars of the man are what is so interesting and fascinating, because he was capped with thorns. He was scourged, tortured with a Roman flagrum. He was nailed through his wrists and through his feet. And he also has a spear wound to his side. And the size and shape of that wound exactly matches the Roman lancia, which was used by the Roman soldiers during the first century. So there's this very, very faint image. It's only about 15% darker than the background of the linen. So it's difficult to see. It's been described as a watery image, but it's a light sepia color and very indistinct when you view it with the naked eye.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously someone noticed it enough to the point where they've clearly been able to enhance it with photography, so you can see it a little more, a little additional contrast there.
Well, let me explain that, because it's actually not enhanced with photography. What happened was, I told you the Savoy family owned the shroud, and in 1898, the city of Turin was participating in a big arts event across all of Italy. And so they wanted to have the shroud be put on display as a part of this arts event. And so they had an amateur photographer come and photograph the shroud. It had never been photographed before. Photography was a brand new thing. And so they hired this man named Secundapia, and he came and set up his photography equipment. And of course, back then it was a huge box with a small aperture. And so he made his exposure onto his glass plate, which was treated with a material to make it receptive to the image. But then he had to take this glass plate, take it home, and put it into his developing solution in his darkroom. And so when he did that, and the idea is this developing solution creates a photographic negative. And then from the negative, you put the photo paper on it and you get your positive image. So Secundapia put his photographic plate into this developing solution. And as he lifted the plate out, he saw the face on the shroud in amazing clarity. And he said in his notes, in his diary, that he nearly dropped the glass plate because it was so shocking to him what he saw. Because a normal photographic negative, the lights and the darks are reversed. And so it's very difficult to see. But in the case of the shroud, it appeared that what you see with the naked eye is acting like a photographic negative. So when he produced a photographic negative, a negative plus a negative equaled a positive image. So it wasn't an enhancement. It was just a natural part of the photography process that when he viewed that photographic negative for the first time, he saw with amazing clarity the image of the face of the man on the shroud. And so that was in 1898. And as you said, this is the great mystery. So first of all, how did this very murky image get on this organic piece of linen cloth from 2,000 years ago? And then how does it act like a photographic negative? And so this was in 1898, and it began the modern era of scientific study on the shroud. And from there, many more mysteries about the shroud were discovered, which we can discuss.
Yeah, and there's been some things in the news even as recent as I think within the last year. So yeah, talk about that a little bit, because before we get into the modern era, there was even some disagreement in terms of the authenticity of it, going back to and this is one of my favorite parts of Catholic history, by the way, like the split, the division of in the two popes era. So you've got the 1300s, 1389, the Bishop of Troyes, in a message to anti-Pope Clement the Seventh, I believe it was, is arguing that it's an artistic rendering. But then you've got Pope Julius II, who reverses that position in the 1500s. So even within the Catholic Church, there's been some debate over the authenticity. But again, this kind of leads into what we're getting to, the modern times. Like, they didn't really have the technology to perform any kind of real tests either way. So it's kind of like you just kind of rolled with one opinion or the other, and then just kind of went based off of whatever historical evidence you could point to. And so talk about, I believe it is, and obviously you can correct me on this, but the 1970s, I think, if I remember correctly, sort of was the first time where they really started to put it to the test.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So they were in the Air Force, and they were a group of friends who worked together, and they were very interested in the shroud, and they wanted to investigate its physical and chemical properties from a scientific perspective. And this was in, I believe, 1976. And they had access to a machine that was called a VP8 image analyzer. And at the time, that was the ultimate in technology. Today, it looks like your grandpa's old stereo equipment. But it was an analog device, and it could take lights and darks and then create almost like a terrain map or a three-dimensional graph of the image based on the lights and darks in the image. So they took the photograph of the shroud and put it into this VP8 image analyzer. And a typical photograph would leave a very, very distorted image from the VP8. But in the case of the shroud, it created almost like a three-dimensional image of the man of the shroud. So they were able to see that the image on the shroud actually wrapped the face of a real human being. The cloth draped around the shoulders and the knees and the feet of an actual three-dimensional figure to create the image. It's not flat. Sometimes if you've ever seen like those death masks, that they are very distorted because they're wrapped around the face, and then when they flatten them out, they're distorted. But in the case of the shroud, the image created is very lifelike, because the way the image was created came came directly from inside the body itself and wasn't applied on the outside. And I'll send you some pictures to try to illustrate what I'm talking about. So this group of scientists, they were so intrigued by this discovery that the shroud contained what appeared to be three-dimensional information actually encoded in it. And remember, it's just so remarkable that this is on a piece of fabric, and the image itself is so superficial. It doesn't penetrate into the fabric of the shroud. So all of this three-dimensional type of information was available on this piece of fabric. And so they were so fascinated by this that they formed the Shroud of Turin research project team. And it was a group of scientists. They were mostly Americans, but it was an international group. And I believe there were about 24 or 25 of them who actually traveled to Turin. And it was after an exposition of the shroud in 1978. And following the exposition, the shroud was brought directly to this team, and they had set up their own laboratory to examine the shroud. And they were given 5 days and nights, 120 hours. And they could perform any test on the shroud as long as it didn't hurt the shroud in any way. It could not be destructive. And so what they ended up doing was a lot of photography, a lot of X-ray photography, micro photography, photography under different kinds of lighting. And then they also took some, we call it sticky tape samples. So they just literally put tape onto the surface of the fabric and lifted it off to see what they could see under the microscope. So that was in 1978. And that really, as I said earlier, that was the only multidisciplinary study, in-depth scientific study of the shroud that has ever occurred.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'm almost sort of surprised by that, considering the intrigue of it. But so talk about what were their initial findings as of the 70s, and we can kind of talk, as we get further into history here. But what did they initially find? What were some of the, because obviously, as you mentioned, there's a lot of different unique qualities to this. There's sort of that photographic imagery, and then there's also the purported blood stains in the areas where, we see within the text of Scripture that it sort of matches the accounts, portrayed in the Bible. So talk about some of what are the things that they noticed,
So this was a scientific quest, and they had two goals. The one is they wanted to understand what we call the blood stains. They wanted to understand, was that blood? What are the components of those stains? And then the second thing was they wanted to understand the image. What made the image? What is the image formed out of? Understand the properties of the image. And one of the more famous members of that team was a man named Barry Schwartz, and he was the documenting photographer for the STURP team, and also a man from the Jewish faith. And he had so many great stories about his time with STURP. But he said he thought, hey, this sounds like a free trip to Italy, because he figured they would go in, they would look at the shroud, and in 15 minutes they would say, oh, this is a painting or a rubbing or photo, some sort of something that he could explain. And he said the more they looked at it, the more they studied, the more they realized this was an image that is unlike any other image that exists. And so after their 5 days of study, the team brought all of their results home, and then they continued to study, and then they brought in additional scientists for the STURP team. And they looked at things under the microscope, and they put all of their best scientific heads together to come up with some kind of a conclusion. And their ultimate conclusion was that there's no brush strokes, there's no defined edges to this image, there's no dyes, no paints, no stains, no evidence of there being a rubbing. And so they said, all we can say at this point is that the way the image was formed remains a mystery. And they said it's up to another team of scientists in the future to understand how this image was made. So what they discovered about the image is that it's only 2 microns thick, which I can't even visualize 2 microns. But if you take a human hair and cut it in half and throw away half and then cut the half remaining in half again and throw that away, that is about the depth of 2 microns. So it's so superficial. The image does not penetrate into the fabric of the shroud. It doesn't even penetrate the cell wall of the flax that makes up the linen fibers. So it's completely superficial, and it doesn't penetrate through the fabric in any way. It's only lying on the very surface of the fabric itself. So they discovered that, and they discovered that it is a chemical change in the fibers in the area where the image exists. So it's actually like almost a premature aging of the fibers in that area. And that's what they were able to discover. It's not something that was applied to the linen. It was actually a chemical change in the fibers themselves.
Interesting. So obviously they even knew at that moment that, hey, you know, we're doing the best we can with the technology we have at our disposal as of 1970, you know, whatever. Knowing that, you know, obviously the scientific equipment available to them will advance over time. And so what is the next sort of study or tests that are conducted after that initial group?
So the next step was in 1988. There was a team put together to make recommendations for doing a radiocarbon dating test. And the goal of that test was to ascertain the age of the fabric. Because as we've said, the provenance of the fabric is murky. And so the radiocarbon dating is the gold standard for dating an archaeological object. And so the team made recommendations. At that time, there was a new method of radiocarbon dating and an older method. They recommended that both methods be used. They also recommended that 7 different laboratories be used with blind testing so that they could get the best results possible. And then the most important thing they recommended is that the samples that were utilized by the 7 different laboratories be taken from 7 different locations on the shroud. So not just from one spot. But in the end, none of these recommendations were followed. So as I told you, that when they did the test in 1978, they photographed the shroud using a lot of different kinds of lighting. And one of the lightings that they used was ultraviolet light. And it shows the chemical composition in colors. And when you look at the image of the area that they chose to sample for the radiocarbon dating, you can see it's an entirely different color than the rest of the shroud fabric. So they picked an area it was an area that had been handled a lot in the past. And it's thought that area had been repaired in the past. And they cut a small piece, one piece, and then they cut the piece into different sections. So, I mean, even a middle school student knows that if you cut one piece and cut it up into different samples, it's still just one sample.
Right.
And so they did not follow the protocol that had been outlined at all. So this small piece was cut up into 4 smaller pieces, about the size of a postage stamp. And one piece was kept as a reserve for like a control. And then the other 3 pieces were sent to 3 different laboratories, not 7. They all used only one form of the radiocarbon dating. And the range of possible dates for the shroud came up between 1260 and 1390, which was Middle Ages. And also coincidentally, around that range includes the time when the shroud was first discovered in written history as well. So at that time, there were headlines all around the world that said, Shroud of Turin proven to be a fake. And I remember it very clearly because it was such devastating news. And it seems so definitive. Like, well, here's the answer. This is a medieval forgery. And so for about 10 years, the whole shroud world I think we were in mourning. It was a very quiet time. And then slowly people started questioning this radiocarbon dating. Well, what about the area where it was sampled? Why didn't they follow the protocol? And so these questions started to emerge. And now it's in 2017, a researcher asked use the Freedom of Information law and got the raw data from each one of these laboratories that did the radiocarbon dating. And when he was able to statistically analyze the raw data, what he discovered is that there's a very big difference between one edge of the sample to just 2 millimeters away or 2 centimeters away for the other sample. There's a 200-year difference in that sample. And one sample should be homogeneous and not have that difference in the date range. So a publication was published in 2019. It was actually the same publication that published the original 1988 carbon dating, published in 2019, said, we can conclude now that the sample that was tested was not homogeneous, meaning it wasn't the same throughout the sample, and therefore not representative of the fabric, the entire fabric of the shroud. So that is a test that we can just set aside. It might have been done perfectly well, and all of the labs may have been absolutely perfect in how they conducted the study, but the sample itself was not representative of the entire piece of fabric. And so we can set the radiocarbon dating aside. So where does that leave us in terms of the date of the fabric itself? So there have been other researchers who have proposed different ways of dating the fabric itself. The one that you mentioned that's been in the news recently was done, I believe, in 2022, and it's now become available in the news. And so they're using different ways of measuring the lignin that remains in the flax. So because they know the rate at which it decays over time. And so they can look at the lignin that's remaining to understand how old the fabric is. So these new studies, and there's some other different studies that are being conducted as well, they are indicating the age of the fabric itself is somewhere between 50 BC and 100 to 200 AD, which of course the life and death and resurrection of Jesus is right in the middle of that range.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it must be, as someone who is well versed in the Shroud of Turin, kind of frustrating when like some very clear, I think, guidance was suggested that it sounds like that's the way to go. That's clearly like we need to. It kind of flushes out any potential error or any question, because you're taking multiple samples from multiple different areas. And we know historically, as you mentioned earlier, that there were likely some repairs done over time. There was, I believe, a fire at some point, and some melted silver ended up burning some holes through it. And so we know some patches were put in place. And so, like, given the history of it, of what we know, it seems that, yes, like, you would have to be very careful when scientifically testing it to take that in consideration when you're testing. So that must have been highly frustrating.
And it remains highly frustrating because still to this day, if you do a Google search on the shroud, you will get results that say radiocarbon dating shows it's a medieval forgery. And so, I mean, that's completely erroneous that has been set aside. And I don't even like using that word forgery, because there were copies of the shroud that were made in the Middle Ages. And I think you mentioned earlier about the Bishop of Troyes and the Pope and the anti-Pope, the Avignon Pope. And perhaps they were looking at copies of the shroud. They might not have been done for wicked or evil reasons. They might have been done for devotional reasons. So to make a copy of something that could be put in a church for devotional reasons. So I don't even like using the word forgery, but it's if there was a medieval copy made, it clearly was meant to point to the suffering and death of Jesus because of all of the coincidences. I'm putting coincidences in quotation marks with the narrative, the gospel narratives about the passion and death of Jesus.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I mean, it just goes to show it's a great example of how just quickly technology has advanced over the last 100 years, just from the 70s till the late 2000s and so on. And so, no doubt they will continue to develop technology in such a way that they can conduct additional tests down the road and do so in a way, because I think one of the biggest struggles that I have as somebody who's a great lover of history is so often these tests that we historically have access to result in at least some damaging of the material itself that it's testing. And so there's this kind of give and take in terms of like, well, we want to know the answers, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that we are going to have to destroy a certain piece of this fabric. But yet, as we know, we've seen throughout history, just in terms of the advancement of like DNA testing, for example, and when it comes to like crime scenes and things like that, that it's continued to advance to the point where that's no longer as much the case anymore. And so talk about maybe some of the most recent studies that have been done. And also, I'm kind of also fascinated by the fact that if we've got blood stains potentially on the cloth, that feels like it should be fairly easy to test, right?
So you raise a lot of really great issues. The first one is about that any destructive testing, we want to avoid that. We don't want to do anything that could potentially damage or harm the shroud in any way. We want to make sure it's available for all future generations. And so the testing needs to be very conservative and protective of the shroud. So those additional tests that I mentioned that are being conducted, they're all using techniques that are not destructive. As far as I know, there has been no collection of any additional samples of any material from the shroud since 1988. The possible exception to that is in 2002, there was a restoration performed on the shroud. And so, as you mentioned, that it was in a terrible fire in 1532, and the shroud was inside of a silver reliquary box, and the fire was so hot that some of the metal from that box melted. And the shroud was folded up, and some of that molten silver or molten metal dropped on the shroud fabric and burned holes all the way through it. And then also there are singes that go along the areas where the shroud was folded. And as I mentioned, when you look at the shroud, those are the things that really catch your eye. And in the photographs from 1978, those big old patches that were sewn on in 1534 are very evident in the photographs. So in 2002, there was a lot of concern that there were ash and cinders trapped in the patches. And so the patches were very, very carefully removed, and the areas of the fabric that were singed were cut away. And so all of those little pieces were preserved so that they would be available for future testing. So that has been removed from the shroud since 1988. But as far as I know, no other pieces have been removed from the shroud for additional testing. That's why I keep saying there really hasn't been a multidisciplinary study of the shroud since 1978. So people who are doing studies today, they're either using materials that were gathered 2002 or before, or they're just using things like photographs and slides and things like that are available to people.
Yeah, it's still very interesting because, again, as technology evolves, we have different tests at our disposal that we didn't, before that could lend some credence to the shroud. So what are the most recent tests that they've done, and what are some of the conclusions that they've come up with?
Well, I kind of keep skirting around the most recent tests because they did do some tests in 2002 and they've been widely reported, but they also made a lot of big assumptions about the control for the shroud during the time to draw the conclusions that they made. And so, I think I'd just like to say, I think further tests need to be done. And I think they also need to be peer reviewed in the scientific community. So, and they need to make sure that the assumptions that they're making are valid. So just as an example, in one of the tests, they were making assumptions that the shroud was kept in a temperature controlled environment for the entirety of its existence. And so that's probably not a good assumption. So
no.
that affects the validity of any conclusions that you make. Yeah,
very much so. And yeah, it just feels like we see some of the mistakes that were made in the past, some of the suggestions that were not followed. And it feels like this would be pretty easy to rectify, in a future study with the right people in place and, again, the right controls in place. So one of the questions I think I have is, is it possible for, I guess, the shroud to still have a role for the faithful regardless of its authenticity? Because I think at the end of the day, sometimes it's, we talk about legends a lot on this podcast, and sometimes getting to the historical truth sort of takes away from the power behind that legend and the positive effect it may have on the people who are listening and recounting this story. And so do you feel like that's something that would be true for the shroud as well, or is it important to authenticate it?
So I have two responses to that. One is we've been talking about one test, the radiocarbon dating test, to date the age of the linen fabric. That's one test that we can set aside. There are a multitude of other tests that point to the authenticity of the shroud. In fact, the preponderance of the evidence about the shroud is significant, so that I feel like we can say with a lot of comfort that this is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. So because of the preponderance of all of the other evidence, and that totally outweighs the few things that you could bring up from a skeptical point of view. So that's one thing from kind of more of a scientific point of view. But I think the question that you're asking is to get at what is the relevance of this to people of faith. And actually, that's my favorite part of talking about the shroud, because it is such a way to access what Jesus suffered for us, because the Gospels are very vague. And I actually just went to a lecture last night where they were showing a piece of art that they said was the very first time they think the crucifixion of Jesus was depicted in art. It was very small. And it was in the 5th century before Jesus was ever depicted as crucified. And the lecture was by Bishop Barron. And what he was saying was that the institutional knowledge of people was so, crucifixion was a part of their knowledge of their ancestry. And it was so gruesome and so cruel and so violent that they did not want to remember it. They did not want to replicate it. But starting in about the 5th century, that was starting to be lost. And so crucifixion was beginning to be depicted in artwork. And that was very revelatory to me, because I've always wondered, why are the Gospels so vague? They say Pontius Pilate condemned Jesus to death and handed him over to be crucified. And not much more. I mean, we get that he handed him over to be scourged, and then they led him out to the place of execution. But they don't tell us, what was that scourging like? What was crucifixion like? And people didn't know, after Constantine outlawed crucifixion with the Edict of Milan, we didn't know what crucifixion meant. And we didn't know how it was carried out. And so in the artwork of the Middle Ages, we have the nails going through the palms of the hands. And we know now from studies done on the shroud that the nail wounds, actually the exit wound was the wrist, because the palms were not sufficient to hold the body weight of a human form. So I'm bringing all of this up because the shroud gives us a way to access what Jesus endured. And it gives us a way to ponder on his suffering, and not to be morbid, but to really understand what Jesus took on for us, what our salvation means. And when people start learning about what the agony truly, in what Jesus incurred in that agony, it's very moving, and it's also very personal. And then we see this body of Jesus being wrapped in this very valuable, priceless piece of fabric. And we see him being buried in a new tomb. So he's died this terrible, ignominious death, but then he's being treated like the precious king and priest and prophet that we know from our faith that he is. And then we have this mysterious, miraculous image that cannot be explained by science. And it leads you to the only natural explanation is it must have been formed at the moment of his resurrection. That is the only explanation in my mind for how this image could be on there. And so it's a journey. It's a journey going down into the depths of the suffering that Jesus endured, waiting patiently through the Sabbath in this time of quiet and mourning, and then this victorious triumph on Easter Sunday, and this miraculous resurrection that left this image behind that gives us such an entryway into understanding our faith.
Yeah, it is interesting. I kind of go back and forth often when it comes to the passion part of the story of Jesus, because, on one hand, it's like, are we dwelling too much on the morbidity of the situation? But on the other hand, it really is just this story of like Jesus or God in the form of a human being, allowing free will to carry out to such an extent that God's own people are literally killing God and torturing God in such a way that he's even allowing us to carry out that free will to the greatest extent. And it's like, wow, so it is kind of interesting. And I often I wrestle with that, One of the things I want to ask you before we go, though, is one of the things I almost forgot about this too, is if you could speak to the image on the shroud. One of the critiques that often it gets is the proportions of the features, and the critics would say that the proportions are not in line with the normal proportions of a human being. So I'm sure that much study has gone into that part of it. What would you say to that part?
So that criticism usually comes to the images around the hands of the man of the shroud, and people say, oh, his fingers are way too long. That's not a normal length of fingers. And so there's some understanding that maybe what is being seen is actually the bones of the fingers of the man. So and this is a great area where further study needs to be performed. Are we seeing some of the internal structures of his body in this image? Because this image formation, we don't know how it happened. We don't know what kind of radiation or what kind of light might have caused this image to be formed. So is it acting somewhat like an X-ray so that we can see internal structures? Some people feel like they can see the teeth of the man. Some people say they can see the backbone. And so is that distorting the image in a way that makes people think that it's not accurate? We haven't really talked much about the blood, but the blood is an area that has been studied extensively in the images. And so what has been discovered is that there's the blood stains themselves, and then when the shroud was photographed under UV fluorescent lighting, there were halo serums that you could only see with that particular lighting. And what that shows is that the blood acted exactly like blood acts in life. That when blood is spilled, then as it starts to coagulate and form into a scab, it kind of retracts. And so it comes together, and then it leaves a clear halo around the actual retracted blood. And so on the wounds, when they are photographed in UV fluorescent light, you can see these serum halos. You can't see them with the naked eye, but under that lighting, you can see it. And just kind of going back to your question about the faith, one of the most fascinating places where this is very clear is in the side wound. So the scriptures tell us that the Roman soldier came to Jesus. He did not break his legs because he was already dead, which is fulfillment of the Passover lamb, that he should be unblemished. None of his bones shall be broken. But then he pierced his side with this lancia. And again, it's the gospel writer John. He's at the foot of the cross. He's an eyewitness. And he tells us 3 times, I saw this for myself, and I want you to know this is what I saw. That when the side of Jesus was pierced, blood and water flowed forth. And people have always said, well, how can that even be? Why would blood and water flow out? Well, we understand now a lot through study of the shroud that Jesus probably died from a dramatic heart incident. And that because of all the torture he endured, that there was probably a big buildup of fluid around his heart. And so when that pericardium was pierced, that fluid, that clear liquid serum flowed out and would have looked to John like water, and then followed by the heavy, dense red blood. And that was not visible until it was photographed in 1978 on the shroud under UV fluorescent lighting. And so I bring that up because we have it in the scriptures, and now we have it where we can see it on the shroud. And it's a way for us, we don't need to test the scriptures. We take the scriptures on faith. But it's a way for us to see the truth of what John was telling us, that blood and water flowed out. And Jesus, to me, this is so significant because Jesus kept saying, I will rebuild the temple, will destroy the temple, and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And you have to picture the temple that the people were thinking of, Herod's temple, the first century temple. And on the right side of that temple was a drain. And so all of those little lambs that were coming to be sacrificed, they would slit their throats and drain the blood out. All of that blood would be washed down the drain, and that blood and water would pour out the right side of the temple. And we see that exactly happening on the body of Jesus, his blood and water flowing out, and then we also see it on the shroud. So it's a way for us to explore our faith in a different way, in a way that is open to questioning and probing, and it's in no way in conflict with the scriptures.
Yeah, and not to mention, how many references to Jesus as the Lamb,
Yes.
That's so. I know we're running short on time here, but I just want to give time to make sure that, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you think is important for listeners to know?
There's so many things about the shroud. It's been a lifelong topic of interest for me. And it's the kind of thing where you can go in multiple directions. So you can just pick a topic that is of interest to you. You have mentioned several times you like history. So you can explore history, and your love of history will be enlivened by including the shroud in that study. Of course, there's all the science, but for me, I really like the connections to the scriptures, because when you start listening for the shroud in the scriptures, you will start hearing it and seeing it in many, many places, and it will just kind of invigorate your study of the scriptures. So I guess I invite people to explore the shroud. It can stand up to all of your questions. It can stand up to probing, and we're invited in. We're invited in to ask those questions and to explore, but the shroud is not an end in itself. It points us to Jesus. And the reason why I think the shroud was left for us is so it's for this generation. It's for the skeptical generation that loves science and wants to have everything be explained neatly by science. And I believe that this has been left for us for now, for this time, for us to explore, use the shroud as a way to deepen our faith and to get to really know the person of Jesus, not just to end with the study of this fabric, which is fascinating and I love it, but it's there to help us to become heirs of the kingdom with Jesus. That's what he left it for us for.
Yeah, and as a complete aside, I'm just like, if this is real, then technically we have Jesus DNA. That's kind of neat, I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, it's one of the most fascinating sort of mysteries out there, and artifacts. And again, when we're talking about history, it's one thing to talk about history. It's another thing to talk about ancient history, which this is, because the resources or the firsthand accounts that you have to work with are so few. But as you said, we've got the Gospels, the Gospel accounts that all sort of hit on these different points, that we see within the Shroud, and it's just this fascinating thing. So where can people go to stay up on top of what you're up to, learn more about the Shroud? What are some resources for them?
So I have a website. It's www.shroudeducator.com, and I try to keep it updated, but there are a lot of things going on in the Shroud world, so I do my best. The other place is I'm a part of an organization called Athonia, and that is spelled Othonia. And Athonia is the Greek word that John uses in his gospel to describe the burial cloths that are left behind in the tomb. And Athonia is based in Rome, and we are a part of the Regina Apostolorum, which is a pontifical university in Rome. And we're trying very hard to educate people about the Shroud and make sure that we use only the best information. So, I tried to be very clear, like this is a theory, or this is hasn't been completely proven yet, because we want to make sure that we're giving authoritative information that people can depend on, that this is good, up-to-date, clear, concise information. So Athonia is a wonderful resource. We actually have launched an update to our website. So our current website is not up to date yet, but it will be in the future. And we aim to have really wonderful, up-to-date resources available for people.
That's fantastic. I will certainly put those in the show notes so people can go out and check it out. In addition, we'll have photographs on both the website and on social media, so Instagram and that type of thing. Nora, thank you so much. This is a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your time today, so thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject.
Does he know that I'm alive? Is God even here? Does she care that I doubt? Does she care that I fear? Something tells me God will survive. So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this, a universe we don't know. I think the truth is, if God has a face, his face must look like yours. Did God kill his kid? Did he have to have blood before he would forgive? Maybe we made a God that looks like us. Does God know my name? Is the ache in my soul just confined to my brain? Even so, does that mean it's not real? So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this, a universe we don't know, but I think the truth is, if God has a face, her face must look like yours. A face like a Tina, an Ahmed or Mildred, a Russ and his husband, Gus and their children. Face like a Kim, a Ted or Tyrone, a